Uhuru comrades. What we're going to do now, as you can tell by the schedule that you've been given for the summer project, is involve ourselves in a discussion on dialectical and historical materialism. We say dialectical materialism, but historical materialism is simply the application of dialectics to the study of society itself. First of all, I want to say that this is not a discussion that we can do sufficiently and effectively in the time that's allocated for it. It's a lot more involved than the amount of time, but this hopefully is something that we can start that can whet our curiosity and influence us to really study this issue independently and try to perhaps even initiate studies within our different organizations and committees. I should say the same thing about some other important theoretically based discussions we've had in the past as well. We had a discussion on the state. We had a discussion on what we characterize as a national question, or what has been characterized in the past as a national question. And in many ways, we only touched the tip of the iceberg on these issues. We have come to certain kinds of conclusions independent of and separate from the conclusions reached by some of the people whose works that we use as resources for this. But I think it's really important. You will find that if you investigate the question of the state, you will find that in addition to some of the classical and traditional readings on this that we use in our study, that there are even discussions that goes on today, struggling around the question of the state. How does the state look? And not so much really struggling around the question of the state as how the state acts today. If we assume that the state is something that emerged in human society at a juncture when it was split into irreconcilably divisions, where you had one sector of the society expropriating value from another sector of society. Say the state emerged at this time in history, then there's a lot of time has passed since that. And we've seen the state different during times of European feudalism, during times of European slavery, and what came to be known as capitalism. And even today we see the state changing in many ways in terms of how it articulates itself throughout the world. The same thing is true of the national question. I mean, part of what we will understand with this discussion around dialectics is that there's an ongoing process of development, that motion, like is a condition for the existence of all things in social, and it is also a condition for the existence of society itself. So there's motion, change, development in all things, and it is a principle of dialectical understanding that everything is dying out. At the same thing, there's something new being born to replace it. And so the question of the nation has not always looked the same. It does not, and it's an ongoing discussion. That's all I'm saying. And you will find different writings and things like that. But I think there's some basic and fundamental things that we have explored in both those discussions, and that we will discover in this discussion on dialectical materialism. We're going to be using as a resource for this discussion materialism and the dialectical method. How many people have read that? Okay. So we haven't done any work prior to now with this, but I think it's an important and relatively well done piece on the study of, it's called Materialism and the Dialectical Outlook, Dialectical Method, and everyone has a copy of that. It's done by a guy named Maurice Cornforth. It's a relatively old piece. He was like 1971, and he was Briton and a member of the Communist Party in England. And we use this study, notwithstanding the fact that there are various prejudices that we discover here in some understandings that he had, as well as other people who we've talked about. We've talked about the fact that much of the theory that we've had to look at has been, contaminated with a certain kinds of prejudice, certain assumptions that the theoreticians or the people came into the discussion with. For example, if you read Marx and sometimes Engels and sometimes even Lenin, you will hear this discussion about the uncivilized people and, et cetera. It starts off with a certain assumption about who the rest of the world was outside of Europe. And a certain assumption of the fact that Europe was the center of the universe, around which everything else revolved. Even much of how they understood the emergence of capitalism and communism in the world made certain kinds of assumptions of transformation that would happen in Europe that would give rise to this phenomenon. So they came with a certain amount of prejudice. But nevertheless, I think that there's science involved here that we can discover and use for our benefit. Here's a fundamental problem for all of them that we've run into, and I have not yet come up with a way to articulate this well. I'm still struggling with it, but you will notice from time to time people use an analogy having to do with dialectics. And this analogy revolves around the difference in quantitative and qualitative change. With quantitative change, of course, being a change in degree, faster, slower, hotter, colder, etc. And qualitative change being a change in the condition, the absolute condition of what it is that we are looking at. And an example that is often used is that if you look at water, which is a liquid, and if you heat water on a stove or by any other means, if you heat water sufficiently, then for a while you have like quantitative change. As I say, it changes in temperature for a while. That's what happens. And then when it reaches a certain point, there's this leap, and then it forms from a liquid to a gaseous stage, gas in the form of steam, right? And that's something that everybody, you don't even have to be a scientist to know that happens. People put on tea. If they didn't know that was going to happen when you put on hot water for tea, you'd have to sit there and watch it all the time to see if it was going to boil this time or not. But people take it for granted. It's going to boil, right? And in fact, they've created means now they can put, like a little whistle on the tea kettle so that you can go and start your laundry or vacuum your floor in the other room, and the thing will boil and call you when it's boiled. It will, it'll whistle for you when it's boiled. And so we know that it's going to boil, and that there's a scientific explanation for why that happens, although it's been really curious. People have been, for a certain juncture, people may have been perplexed about what makes the water boil. And I think that what we've learned is something having to do with the heating of the molecules. The water, the speed of the molecules, is responsible for the molecules heating up and reaching a certain point where it becomes a gas. So that's really good. And we've got scientists who can help us to understand that with no problems at all. That's how much of what we refer to as Marxism, and many of the people who refer to as Marxists that we've been using for studies, for resources, they're able to see the science of the water boiling. They really have got a grip on that. But the problem is that they don't say how the water got in the damn pot. And if the only thing they're going to study is the water in the pot, then their science is good science. But they've left out the question of how the water got in the pot. And there's a severe weakness there. For example, we wouldn't be having a discussion at all about water heating in the pot if there were no water in the pot. Sounds like a really crazy philosophical argument, but it's not. And here's the point that I'm making. That the Marxists are able to define that activity, and they do that relatively well. They can tell us about how production happens in society. They can tell us that as a consequence of a kind of production, for example, capitalist production, it's exploitation at the point of production, that the way capitalism really produces what we call profit and produces period is as a consequence of something that happens, the value that's added to everything at the point of production. Like you take a tree, or you take this table, this podium, and making this podium required people to do a tree, cut the tree down, do all other kinds of things with it, but the value, there was no greater once that happened. What made this valuable is human beings laying their hands on it. And this process is where you get the value that people talk about in the terms of surplus, exploitation, profit, etc. It comes because human beings, workers, turn this thing into the podium. When you sell a podium, it has a value that's much greater than what it was when it was simply a tree or simply wood that had been laid out. But even when you get the tree, then workers go to work on the tree. Workers are the ones who cut the tree down. Workers are the ones who plane, the wood. Workers are the ones who make the podium itself. This is the added value. Marxists are very good at helping us to understand that. Same thing true. You go to Detroit, where it used to have a great automobile industry, and Marxists can tell you how the workers, do so much to create value for General Motors and all the other companies. Workers do that. They can do that with some scientific precision if the only thing they're dealing with is what happens in the shop. The problem is that they didn't say how the water got in the bucket. Where did the bauxite come from that went into the process that created the aluminum that went into building that vehicle? Where did the other resources come from? Of course, it came from Guinea, Conakry. It came from Guyana, and there was other value created to it before it even got there by the labor of African and other people who did that work. The Marxists are good at explaining what happened to it once it got to Detroit. Or if they are looking simply at what happened within the domestic situation, even when they sometimes add the work that was contributed to by the Mexicans, who pick the fruits that end up in Publix or other supermarkets, etc., they're relatively good at that. But do you understand what I'm saying? Here's the contradiction, and this is the contradiction that we're dealing with here. That everything, so there is some science. We can't say that the Marxists are not scientists, or that they're not scientific in terms of what they understand and what they apply, but their view is very narrow. It does not involve the whole picture and everything that went into the process. That's true of what it is that we're dealing with. Is that helpful at all in terms of trying to establish a framework for this? So we're using this Cornforth, materialism, and the dialectical method, and we're saying there's science in this method. But we bring something else to it that Cornforth could not bring to it. And therefore, the science is limited in terms of until we bring this other, because there are so many things people can explain. For example, we all, the African People's Socialist Party, historical materialists. We believe in the dialectical method of investigation, and our analysis is based on materialism. We are materialists. We have come to certain kinds of conclusions about how nations, in the modern sense or the current sense, came into being, especially like in Europe, and how what we now recognize as the nation had to satisfy certain requirements in order for European society to move forward, from feudalism to capitalism. Because you couldn't have capitalism with feudalist relations of production. Feudalist relations of production requires what? The serf being tied to the land, not having any freedom, couldn't leave the land, tied to the land, owned by the landlord, and the serf only receiving a certain part of what he earned, the serf and the family, with the greater part of it going to the landlord. Those are the basic relations of production. The landlord or the nobility owned the land, the serf worked the land, tied to the land, by law, tied to the land, paid taxes and what have you, but only kept a small portion of what it is that they produced. Those were the relations of production under feudalism. But you couldn't have capitalism with those relations of production. In order for capitalism to happen, then the serfs had to be freed from the land, and had to be able to go out and sell the value, sell their labor power to the highest bidder. They say, go and get a job. In other words, that was necessary to move from feudalism to capitalism required the liberation, if you will, of the serf from the land and the ability to go out and sell their labor power. Under feudalism, the serf was tied to the land and had no rights, was immobile except as it related to that land. Didn't have to, and the serf had a forced relationship. But again, that would not work under capitalism. So for capitalism, we had to have a way to keep the worker, used to be tied to the land, still loyal to and committed to the ruling class. Under serfdom, under feudalism, it was the laws and everything else, the fact that it was tied to the land, except, and couldn't go anywhere, that kept them loyal. Do you understand? It was force like that kept them loyal. But that won't work under capitalism. So what keeps them loyal under capitalism? You had to have a way for the bourgeoisie to win the loyalty of the workers who are being exploited. In this new setup, you had to have a changed relations of production in order for the forces of production to go forward. And for that, we created there was a need for a new system. That's where the idea of the nation comes about. The nation, then, is something that obscures the class contradictions in that society, that obscures what as it was before. The serf knew that when he finished working, that the nobility was going to come, or the sheriff or somebody was going to come and take part of the crop, most of the crop. Still had to pay taxes. If a war came, they were forced to go and fight the wars for the ruling class. This was at gunpoint. They had to do that. But now the serf has to be free. That's why Marxists talk about how capitalism was progressive, because now the serfs have to be free. No longer serfdom. You got to have these producers who can now go out. They have to have freedom to move around, to go out and sell the value of their labor power. So what keeps them loyal? My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. You don't have to now force them to go out and kill and die. You don't have to force them to go out and kill other workers who might have the same interests as they have. They volunteer to do it. They knock you down trying to get to it. They carry the flag all the way to do it. They are now loyal to the bourgeoisie. You see, what I'm saying is that there's a particular need for society to move forward from feudalism to capitalism, that you see the emergence of the nation. It didn't come because, you know, as the pledge says, one nation, under God, indivisible, etc. God didn't have anything to do with this. It was necessary to change the relations of production from feudalism to capitalism. The producers had to be freed from the land. And this, you see the emergence of the existing nations come about for that purpose. That's how it happens. We believe that. We are materialists, and we look for answers in society, in the society itself. We don't go someplace else looking for the answers to why things happen in society. You want to know what happened in society? There's so many people because of ignorance. Most of us are ignorant in terms of anything called laws of social development and don't even know why we do most of what it is that we do. And because of ignorance, you will see people who will say that we did it because God has something to do with it. That's why this happened, because God was at work. Because they don't understand anything about relations of production. They don't understand how things get produced. You know, at the time, you remember, if you know, anybody's gone to the movies has seen, you know, people in other eras and times, you know, talk about the sun gods and the gods of rain and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because there clearly was some relationship between sun, rain, and crops growing, and people could pick up on that, but they were ignorant about relations of production and what made things happen. I was talking with Brother Jody the other day about the garden, because some of my stuff ain't coming up, right, that I planted. And Jody started talking to me about the sap started rising, and I don't know the hell he's talking about, the sap rising, and what's that got to do with anything, but Jody knows what it has to do with something, and how some things are not going to grow when the sap starts rising. Is that right, Jody? And I don't know how he figured it out, but somebody did. And the point, of course, is that there are laws that governs the activity, it governs things in nature, and the question before us is whether there are laws governing social development as well. Whether there are laws. Do we have to always wait until something happens to say, okay, you know, it's because somebody made a good speech? If somebody comes to make a good speech, if we have a great leader, etc., this would change things in the world. We say Malcolm was great, Martin was great, Marcus Garvey was great, but it's simply because of their greatness that things happen in the world. Could things have happened even with these great leaders if there were not certain other social factors, historical factors at work? Could they have happened? You know, and can we just say that somebody did something because they was an Uncle Tom? Is there a way to understand something about how society is structured that would help us to understand that there's a greater likelihood that somebody is going to be on the forward side of history, or whether they're going to try to keep history from moving forward? Is there a way that we can do this without having to wait until somebody betrays the revolution, till a social group betrays the revolution and say, oh, they did it because they were Uncle Toms? Is there something about how society is structured that can help us to understand before this stuff happens? These are questions that, you know, we grapple with, and we say there are ways, that there is a science to social development. There are laws of social development that can be understood as easily, or certainly as effectively, certainly as with the same significance as laws of natural science, that we can understand it. And that's the struggle. And all revolution has to have this understanding, has to come to grips with this, so that we're not stumbling through the dark all the damn time, hoping that what we do results in what it is that we're looking for, which is a form of religion. If that's the only thing that you're doing, just go out there and hope something good happens, you know, hope if I hang around long enough, something will develop that will be beneficial. So we want to talk about, so I wanted to say those things, that this is not, you know, just an exercise in, you know, pure abstract reasoning. For example, some of you may have, everybody has to be aware of the situation in Norway, where they say this one guy went and killed what they're saying now 72, 73 people. That he used a bomb in one place and then went to this other place, youth camp, and shot up a whole bunch of other people. And everybody is crazy about, why did he do it? And they're trying to find reasons. They say there's looking for this psychological glitch, this glitch in his brain that would make him do that. And they are trying to make what he just did extraordinary in terms of how things are moving in the world. And I'm saying that there's an explanation for it, that we've talked about it already. When we had the discussion on the national question, we talked about it. And it's related to what you can see, well, with the attack on immigrants all around and throughout Europe, the attack, you know, like on so-called immigrants. It's related to the fact that you can see that, and it's really interesting because Norway was outstanding, because they're saying that in Norway, one of the problems they had is because the police don't carry guns. The police don't carry guns. And so the police response was so long, and you find the same thing being true in some of the other Scandinavian countries. And so, you know, but you find in the Scandinavian countries and throughout Europe, more and more people who are running for office, more and more political parties are basing their campaigns and their platforms on opposition to immigrants. Opposition, not just Muslims, but Muslims too. Opposition to black people. This has been going on for a while. Africans being attacked all over Europe, all the time, from Russia, you name it, to various other places throughout Europe. What in the hell is going on? Why are you going to act like this guy is so peculiar when you just elected, in the Netherlands, they've been elected, you know, right-wing people whose basic platforms have to do with expelling black people and other people from the country. And this guy said that when from his so-called manifesto, as I understand it, he was saying that he was protecting Christendom. Europe. He was defending Europe. And because the problem is, as we understand as African internationalists, is that Europe, the nation, Europe, the nation, has its foundation, was created through slavery, through colonialism and neo-colonialism. This is the thing that brought the whole damn thing together. What we refer to as racism is simply the ideological underpinnings of a whole economy, whole political economy, world economy that was forged through slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. That's where it came from. Now what's happening throughout the world, and so this is the origin of white power in the world. This is how the European nation gets consolidated in the world. But what's happening in the world today is everywhere that, and it's a fundamental transformation that's happening in the whole world that create what we now characterize as a crisis of imperialism. But imperialism has gone through several crises, but this is the one. What is happening is that peoples around the world are successfully struggling, challenging this setup by taking back their resources. That's what Iraq is. That's what Afghanistan is. That's what Palestine is. That's what Venezuela is. That's what Ecuador is. That's what all these struggles are. The whole edifice, the whole thing rests upon this base of slavery and colonialism. And currently it is being rent asunder. So when this guy says he is defending Christendom, he is actually expressing something very deep and profound that's being experienced throughout the white world, not just in Norway, but in St. Petersburg, Florida. So we're not surprised by it. It's no mystique to us, no mystery to us what is going on, because it's science. There's nothing mystery. It's not the guy went crazy. You know, he may be crazy. You understand? He may be crazy. But his insanity is simply that it's an exaggerated sense, if you will, of what everybody else in the society is going through some way or another. Like Jeffrey Dahmer, they say he was crazy. You remember Jeffrey Dahmer? He ate the black community of Milwaukee. Right? They say he was crazy, but he didn't eat no white people. You understand what I'm saying? I'm saying even insanity will be characterized. And then the person who killed Jeffrey Dahmer, you know, he said God told him to do it. He killed 2 people in that prison. He killed Jeffrey Dahmer, and he killed another white man who had killed his children and tried to blame it on black people. And he went and killed both of them in the prison and said God told him to do it. He may have been crazy. But it was simply an exaggerated expression of a sentiment that's deep in the social fabric of the African community, who would be killing a whole bunch of people if it were not fear of the state that we've been talking about, you know. Not just, and I mean this in a literal sense of the word, it is the state that plays a profound role on restraining, like how Africans would be responding to a lot of stuff. And it is the state that also plays a role in restraining most of the white people who would do exactly what this guy did in Norway. So what we're searching for, really struggling for, is a way like to understand this world. And the ruling class works overtime to keep us from an understanding of how the world works, what makes it happen the way it does happen. So that anytime you go shopping at Publix or any other supermarket, when you see them standing right there, you know, when the checkout lines, all kind of garbage to feed your brain with, you know, the 2-headed baby that was born in this place, and how, you know, Elvis was sighted over here or someplace, you know, I mean, all kind of crazy, and not just that extreme, but it's also the Katie and William and what happened with their marriages and what kind of ring they wore and dresses, etc. Just fodder, just madness, just insanity, just crazy stuff, always bombarding the brains of the working and poor people. You will not find that literature in any of the stores or the media outlets for upper class white people. You won't find that literature. You won't find horoscopes, any of that stuff. That stuff is reserved for the masses, to keep the masses, you know, like in this space that is separate from a scientific understanding of the world. That stuff that's, you know, you can go to Borders now, you can find books that the ruling class is talking to each other in these books. They know the masses ain't gonna read this book. Chairman Omali reads it. You understand? Masses are not, they can put it right there in front of the people. People are not going to read this stuff. And that's also true of philosophy. And that's what we want to talk about right now, philosophy. Philosophy. Because you think of philosophy, you think about this old bespectacled white guy, you know, with the beard, you know, maybe a seersucker, what do you call it? What is a seersucker? Something. You know, they usually have a seersucker something. Suit, seersucker suit. And what's that pipe they smoke called? You know, don't they usually have this like Sherlock Holmes type pipe and stuff? You know, that's when you know they're really big shop intellectuals, right? You know, when they're gray-haired and with the patch, the leather patch on the coat and the whole bit. And when we think of philosophy, we don't think of something, generally speaking, that we should be grappling with. And often we are intimidated by some kind of discussion about philosophy, you know. But if we're looking at Cornforth, I like what he talks about in terms of philosophy, because everybody's impacted by philosophy. But philosophy does not fall out of the sky. Philosophy, just like everything else in society, has its basis in the social activity of the society at any given time. You know, philosophy does. And so we're not talking about something that's just a product of some particular genius on a college campus, university, no matter how clever this person may be in articulating these philosophical ideas, or how tricky his concepts may be, entertaining they may be. You know, you've heard them before. You know, the question of, does a tree make a sound when it falls in the forest if there's no one there to hear it, you know? And of course, it's really not that complicated anymore. It might have been complex, you know, once upon a time, but, you know, today it's possible to get a damn sound-activated tape recorder and put it there, you know, and, but the point is that these are the kinds of questions that, you know, and you can say, what in the hell does this have to do with how I'm going to pay the rent, you know, solve any of these, keep these white people off my ass, right? I mean, what relationship does this have to anything? And so philosophy, and then, you know, they use, in some of the words that we're going to be talking about today, you know, they may be slightly intimidating in the beginning, but once we talk a little bit about them and see that the reality that they represent, stuff that we confronted with all the time, then they become less intimidating. But we have to grapple with them. We cannot allow the ruling class and its thinking representatives to dominate this question of ideas. We can't allow them to do that. To simply, you know, treat the rest of us as this mass of people who carry out their edicts, etc., based on ideas that they have constructed and come forward with, and we have nothing to do with it. We have to be able to challenge them in the arena of ideas, right? And as we said, that all of these ideas, all of philosophy, have their basis in activities, in social activities of the time, of the era that they were born. So we want to talk about materialism and the dialectical method. And I like what Cornforth said about, when he defines philosophy, he says, you know, more or less that philosophy, you know, is simply the ideas that we have about the nature of the world and our place and future in it. So we're talking about philosophy. It's a worldview. You will hear people refer to a worldview. It's simply a discussion or the nature of the world. It's the whole thing about the nature of the world and our place and future in it. That's what we're talking about when we talk about philosophy. So I want to just share briefly, and we're going to be, you know, we don't have much time. As you can see, we don't have much time to deal with this. But I want to just go through some stuff and quickly, and hope that you will really take this and look at it, and hopefully by the time we finish this discussion, what it will have done at least is arm everybody sufficiently to be able to go and look at this document, read it, and it'll make some kind of sense, you know, to us. So if you go to just one of the real important points that Cornforth makes in the very beginning of the book, on chapter 1, is that he says how a revolutionary working class party needs a revolutionary working class philosophy, and he calls this philosophy dialectical materialism. I challenge that. I don't think the philosophy is dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is simply a method. It is a method of investigating and analyzing phenomenon. And historical materialism is that method applied to society itself. Dialectical materialism is not the philosophy, it is the method that we use. And because it is a scientific method, it helps us to achieve a philosophy that has its basis in science as opposed to superstition and other kinds of things like that. He also refers to dialectical materialism as Marxism. That's absurd. And I don't even think Marx would have said that. Marx never said that. Though dialectical materialism is something that Marx and Engels in particular and others, wrote a lot about. But, Marx and Engels would both say that their whole notions of dialectics, came from Hegel, who was not a materialist, but he dealt a lot with dialectics. And if you go back further, you will find that dialectics has a history in human society stretching back thousands of years. And how do I know that? Because you couldn't build pyramids without dialectics and materialism. You had to be materialist to do that. You had to be, in order to chart the course of stars in the universe, as in Mali, the Dogon and Mali been doing for thousands of years ago, and you had to have been doing it for a long time, as the Olmec were doing, and the Egyptians were doing, to the point that they have the Mayans, what they call the Mayan temples, which were based on Olmec religion, the calendar, all of that. Olmec and the Egyptians made assumptions about the rotation of the earth that goes back thousands of years to come up with a 365-day calendar, right? So you had to have dialectics and materialism a long time before Marx, ever hit the planet. And but he makes the point here that a revolutionary working class party needs a revolutionary working class philosophy, and that philosophy is dialectical materialism. He calls it a philosophy. And the point that he wants to make is that he says that by philosophy is usually meant our most general account of the nature of the world and mankind's place and destiny in it, our world outlook, our world outlook. This being understood, it is evident that everybody has some kind of philosophy, even though he has never learned to discuss it. Everybody is influenced by philosophical views, even though he has not thought them out for himself and cannot formulate them. And he talks about how some people think that the world is nothing but a veil of tears, and our life in it is preparation for a better life in another world. And of course, we've heard that before, and there are other things, like people who don't consider themselves philosophers, but they have world outlook, world views. In our community, we see this all the time. When we hear about, how you can't beat the white man is, all this, and how you can't live without the white man. In some instances, we hear, all kinds of craziness, but there are various kinds of philosophies that are out there. And if you understand that, well, let me just say more. But granted that our philosophy is our world outlook, and this is page 9, first full paragraph, the task arises of working out this world outlook systematically and in detail, turning it into a well-formulated and coherent theory, turning vaguely held popular beliefs and attitudes into more or less systematic doctrines. This is what philosophers do. By the time the philosophers have worked out their theories, they have often produced something very complicated, very abstract, and very hard to understand. But even though only a comparatively few people may read and digest the actual product of philosophers, these productions may and do have a very wide influence. For the fact that philosophers have systematized certain beliefs reinforce those beliefs and helps to impose them upon wide masses of ordinary people. Hence, everyone is influenced in one way or another by philosophers, even though they have never read the works of those philosophers. And if this is the case, then we cannot regard the systems of the philosophers as being wholly products of the brain work of the individual philosophers. Of course, the formulations of views, the peculiar ways in which they are worked out and written down is the work of the particular philosopher. The views themselves in their most general aspect have a social basis in ideas which reflect the social activities and social relations of the time, and which therefore do not spring ready-made out of the heads of philosophers. And so, say that society is divided into classes, and since that is the case, then that the various systems of the philosophers always have a class outlook. The various systems of the philosophers always have a class outlook. It's not like there's no such thing as a philosophy that is free from a class outlook. They all have a class outlook. And they are, in fact, nothing but the systematic working out and theoretical formulation of a class outlook, or if you prefer, the ideology of definite classes. Philosophy is and always has been class philosophy. Philosophers do not realize this, but that does not alter the fact. Because people cannot think in isolation from society, and therefore from the class interests and class struggles which pervade society any more than they can live and act in such isolation. Does that make sense? That we live and exist in society, and it's class society. You can't think and act in isolation from that reality. So, this being the case, we say that the working class needs its own philosophy if it intends to take over the leadership of society. Because the philosophy of the bourgeoisie tells us all the time that who we are, defines for us the permanence of this whole rotten social system that works against the interests of the vast majority of the people. Every time you turn on your TV and watch and listen to some political pundit, you're hearing class philosophy. It doesn't matter if it's an African who does it, or a Mexican who does it, or a European who does it. It's class philosophy. And because of the world that we live in, and the particular society that we live in, is dominated by the imperialist European bourgeoisie, in most instances, what we will get is a class philosophy that supports, justifies, and reinforces the philosophy of the bourgeoisie. That's what it does, generally speaking. Of course, a great contest is underway now, isn't it? With the philosophy of the European bourgeoisie. Doesn't mean it's any less class philosophy because it's coming from Iran, or it's coming from Venezuela, or it's coming from the African community here. It's still class philosophy, and sometimes it's still bourgeois class philosophy, but it still has and it may have a different character because there's one emerging bourgeoisie contesting with the existing bourgeoisie. And it creates a philosophy that helps it to contest with the existing bourgeoisie. So, the working class has to have its own philosophy. And because if you don't have your own philosophy, what the working class usually does is end up borrowing its worldview from its oppressors, whether you intend to do that or not. And this is one of the things that is really significant about the more educated we are. I'm talking, the more educated we are, the more inculcated, the more, the bourgeoisie has a lock on our brain. The more we have, been fed the philosophy of the bourgeoisie. The more educated we are, the more we're fed the philosophy of the bourgeoisie. And I'm saying this as somebody, who experienced it in a deep and profound way, because I was a better white nationalist than most white nationalists was. In my own development, I was more sincere, believed more in the American way than most white people I knew. I would have arguments with some white people because they were not as, as committed to, the American way and all this stuff as I was, And the more educated, that's what the educational process does. That's part of what it does. It reproduces the ideology of the ruling class. That's part of its fundamental task. I remember being in Oakland, California, and in Oakland, in California, they, like the agriculture is such an important part of the economy. And this thing that they call a Mediterranean fruit fly was infesting the fruit there. And so the government, they went through this whole thing explaining, what it was and how they were going to deal with it. And then they started having these airplanes fly over, spraying to kill the fruit flies. And the Africans were saying, hey, these white people are spraying something to do something bad to us. There ain't no flies they at us, right? And so I said, wait a minute. How you come up with something like that? You said, I read all the explanation they gave. They told us exactly why they were doing this stuff. But upon reflection, the smartest ones was those who were saying, them white people flying this stuff over here to do something to us. Because everything in life has taught us that white people don't run over with airplanes spraying stuff that's going to help us. That if they're doing it, it's to hurt us. It's because I was the educated one, right? That I get sucked into uniting with the explanation that they give for what the hell it is they're doing. When the masses have a better relationship and have not been so brought up into the system in terms of the ideas that they knew better. And of course, it may be that they was killing the Mediterranean fruit fly. But that doesn't mean that I was the smartest one. The Africans who stayed in, when that spraying was going, actually, they understood something quite different about the reality of living here. Isn't that right? I think so anyway. I just hope the damn spray don't kill me. So we use dialectical materialism. We use this method of investigation and analysis. That's all it is. To come up with a scientific and revolutionary theory and approach that we believe, that we characterize as African internationalism, that we think offers a real scientific explanation of why things are as they are in the world, and a suggestion about what it is that we can do to change things in the world. So I just wanted to share this with you quickly. It's in the text, you'll find it. And as we wrote here, dialectical materialism, in understanding this, it helps us to recognize that dialectics is opposed to metaphysics. Dialectical opposed to metaphysical. Materialist is opposed to idealist. Materialism is opposed to idealism. And I know that's not how we've come to understand some things. We think of a materialist as Madonna. Somebody who's just interested in wealth and etc., gluttony and this kind of stuff. And idealism is somebody who, just has these wonderful and assumptions about things and how things can happen in the world. These are good people. And usually we think of metaphysical as being, spookism, ghosts and other stuff like that. That's not how we deal with this. When we talk about philosophical metaphysical and philosophical idealism and materialism, we mean something quite different from that, as we will see. So we say the three main assertions of idealism. One, idealism asserts that the material world is dependent on the spiritual. Idealism asserts that the material world is dependent on the spiritual. Idealism asserts that spirit or mind or idea can and does exist in separation from matter or the material. Idealism asserts that there exists a realm of the mysterious and unknowable, above or beyond or behind what can be known by perceptions, experience, and science. That's idealism. that the material world depends on the spiritual, that spirit or mind or idea can and does exist in separation from matter. And then there's this thing called subjective idealism, which is even more extreme. Subjective idealism makes the assumption that really nothing exists except in our mind, right? It exists because I think it's there. You've heard people make those arguments, you know. I'm free because I think I'm free. You know, I mean, nothing exists except in our mind. That's what's referred to as subjective idealism. Idealism asserts that there exists a realm of the mysterious and unknowable, above or beyond or behind what can be known by perception, experience, and science, that you can't know that. In fact, you've heard people say that's not meant for us to know. In fact, if you remember some of the old horror movies, you know, like which really represent a certain contest between science and idealism. You know, like the Frankenstein is one of the best examples, because now, you know, the creation of life, you know, that's just better left to God, etc. We're not supposed to tinker with this kind of stuff, you know. And we've even heard people say stuff like, well, anyway, that's a form of idealism. That's an expression of a certain kind of idealism. And in fact, at a certain time, when you saw movies and books written by, was that Shelley who wrote Frankenstein? You know, during this period of time, you know, there was real contest between science. There's a whole bourgeois struggle to use science for things, because the bourgeoisie was relatively progressive in terms of needing science to move itself forward, progressive within the context of what was in the bucket already, all right? Of needing science to do things with industry and etc. And so, and there was a resistance to the bourgeoisie from a lot of different angles. And part of it was, you know, stuff like we saw coming from Shelley, you know, the struggle against science, you know, and because the other thing was science was used against people too, wasn't it? You know, what we call science. I mean, that's where, you know, Tuskegee and atomic bombs and all this other stuff came as well. And that helps to frighten people about science. And, you know, the whole notion that there are things that people are not supposed to know. You're just not supposed, this is not meant for us to know. So materialism is in opposition to these three main assertions of idealism. Materialism teaches that the world is by its very nature material, that everything which exists comes into being on the basis of material causes, arises and develops in accordance with the laws of motion of matter. Materialism teaches that matter is objective reality existing outside and independent of the mind, and that far from the mental existing in separation from the material, everything mental or spiritual is a product of material processes. Materialism teaches that the world and its laws are knowable, and that while much in the material world may not be known, there is no unknowable sphere of reality which lies outside the material world. And, you know, you've heard people talk about mind over matter. That's an example of this contest, this big contest that many people say is the big struggle, you know, like a philosopher, is the distinction between thinking and being, the contradiction between thinking and being. Which is prior, you know, the spiritual or the material? Mind over matter. You hear people, you've seen a bumper sticker, I think, therefore I am, you know, which is crazy. You know, you are, therefore you think. You understand? That's the reality. It makes the assumption that there can be such a thing as mind without matter. Mind, and the reality, of course, is that mind is a product of matter, isn't it? Isn't it? Mind is a product of the brain, which is matter developed to its highest, the brain tells me to say this, by the way, you know, which is the brain developed to a very high level. That's what mind is. This whole notion of mind over matter, a mind separate from matter, is an idealism, and we have to reject idealism. Anybody? Uhuru, comrades. What you think? How many people, know people who in their, their worldview, like, how many worldviews, are we familiar with that impact on us negatively in terms of trying to move this struggle forward, trying to move forward? Yeah. Whitney couldn't have thought of inventing the cotton gin. Why couldn't he have invented the cotton gin? Did you hear what K-Fing just said? He was raising the question, because they said that Eli Whitney invented, the white guy invented the cotton gin. He said that's impossible, because Eli Whitney was nowhere close to the cotton. The ones who were picking and had to hump with that cotton are the ones who figured out how to make that cotton thing happen more efficiently and effectively rather than breaking backs doing that. Don't you think that's probably true? Yeah. Janice. Trying to get away from it, and also, Janice, because increasingly what is the reality is, like, bourgeois production or capitalist production under this existing circumstances has run into its limitation, and they don't have answers. And so it's the boogeyman, it's the spiritual, it's all this other weird stuff. And not only do they do that, they are playing more and more comic movies and stuff, Captain America, and the other Thor, that raises up this Nordic, I wonder if that was Thor at work in Norway, but, raises up this Nordic, blue-eyed champions and stuff like that. Even the Superman and Batman stuff. These are mystic heroes that people have to rely on. They can't see a future. They can't see a future, so they go heavily, in the form of ideology, and mysterious, something that has they cannot explain. No science at all. Yes. Because we haven't thought about them? We don't have answers. And that says something about the limitations of idealism. Because idealism blocks human progress, because it challenges, it doesn't, in some ways it even prohibits investigation of the world, right? If you want to understand the world, you say, I want to understand the world, and then somebody tells you to read Genesis, such and such and such a thing. I say, if you understand the world, if you want to understand the world, you investigate what? The world. You'll investigate the world to understand the world, right? And so we say that idealism sometimes frustrates development. And the thing is, back to where Janice was, the bourgeoisie even, when it can't see the future, it falls back on idealism. Not only does it try to spread idealism among masses of people, but itself becomes victimized by forms of idealism that substitute or attempt to substitute for a scientific explanation and understanding of reality. And guess what? I remember going to the movies, and especially horror movies, You know, the ones where the black guy's always the first one to die. But especially horror movies, and you should always be struck by the fact you've seen this movie before in 1,000 different ways. Where you know the monster's at the top of the stairs, the dark stairwell, and the white woman says, "I'm gonna go and see," even though 3 bodies have fallen down, etc., you know. "I'm going to go and see," you know, and she tells everyone screaming, "Don't go up the stairs." But she can't help it. She's got to go up the stairs, right? And, you know, there's a lot said about that, and it's true. Because usually she'll go up the damn stairs, and of course, you know, she gets it. Now, the thing is, increasingly, the movies ain't going to have her going up some stairs, right? Because there's an assumption about the power and significance of whiteness that's built into that damn thing. That crossing the street without looking. You know, even though you're coming up, man, at every damn thing, right? And there's just an assumption that nothing's going to happen to me. Free, white, and 21. But now, increasingly, what's happening is that you ain't going to be able to get her ass up them damn stairs. Even if she's armed to the teeth. Even if the SLA met her and gave her the weapon that Patty Hearst had going into that bank. She's not going up them stairs because there's now more and more fear what's at the top of the stairs. Yeah, Comrade. Yeah. And that's what's really interesting about that is, now there's that idealism, right? That, you know, escaping to idealism and then there's another idealism that I've seen people use to their benefit. For example, the idealism of the indigenous people at different times, where I'm trying to remember who it was. There was a particular chief, they call him chief. This is some white people came up with the term, leaders of indigenous movements and organizations, who said that their medicine wouldn't let the white man bullets kill them. So they were bold and dangerous, and they attacked the white, you know, settlers and every damn body, because from their perspective, the white man couldn't kill them because of the medicine that they used. That's idealism it's still idealism, isn't it? Because ultimately, if everybody thought that the white man couldn't kill them, then that's going to be a real butchery, because this guy's experts at killing, you know. Yeah, and that's Richard Price said, hell, they kill their own God. You know, talking about spiritualism, Richard Price said, these cats kill their own God, said the African God hiding. Yes, yeah, well. You know, were you going to say something, K-Fing?
Yeah, I was going to say that. Thing comes from, you mentioned that at the beginning of the book, you know, you said that we don't necessarily have to be conscious that you stop, you know, that you putting out the world view, but you are.
Yeah.
You know, and not to mention that it blocks investigation of the world. Because maybe 2 nights ago we were having this discussion at the Anti-Trap House. So it boiled down to the sister saying, I just know. I mean, if you take that, I just know it to a courtroom of children, they're not going to go for that. You've got to investigate. Even though you're not saying that it's twisted or whatever, but it's still idealism, and it won't allow you to further investigation. So
Yeah. One of the big issues that we have in our community, I'm talking about African community now. I'm not talking about relationship between Africans and Europeans, North Americans, etc., but the African community is internal, a certain reluctance, or hesitation, or refusal to have certain kinds of discussions. It's just, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to have this discussion. You know, I've seen bumper stickers, God said it, I believe it, that's it. You know, that's it. There is no discussion. And, you know, here's a real fundamental problem. I remember as a child in Sunday school, I asked the preacher this question that my mother berated me for when she got me home, because it was a real problem for the guy. I said, what's going to happen? I was a child in Sunday school, in elementary school. What's going to happen if Judgment Day, you know, that's when the dead rise and everybody, and all the other people go, and if it happens in China, how the hell are we going to get there, right? You know, I was in elementary school, you know, and my mother was, you know, really upset. But I'm thinking about this, right? I'm thinking about this because this is something that they told me was going to happen, and the preacher couldn't explain it, and he was upset, you know, and my mother was upset, you know, like, because of that. But we have to be able to have these discussions. We have to ask the question. We really have to ask the question. Why is it, you know, that, you know, here, you know, right now we're Christians. We weren't Christians before white people got there with guns. We weren't Muslims before white people got there with guns. And why is there Islam over there and Christianity and Buddha, you know, over here, and all these other entities, and they spring from the particular societies, etc., where people exist. And that most of the religions that African people have, most of the religions that we have, are religions that we've got subsequent to being conquered. Conquest. Now, I'm not saying that a religion born in Africa, you know, is better than a religion born in Rome. That's not my position at all. I'm just talking about idealism here. And I'm talking about ignorance and how people, when you don't understand, and to have a worldview that says, because I don't understand how the hell it happened, there must be a God. A worldview based on ignorance is what we are talking about. A worldview that says, and this is an argument, okay. If there's no God, then how the sun get over there and the moon get over there, etc., etc. In other words, if I can't answer these questions, then there must be a God. There is a God based on my ignorance, which is a statement that's being made. And also, there's a God. The more you don't search, the more you don't investigate, then the holier you are. As I say, because it's faith. By faith, I believe. I don't need any evidence of anything in the world. It's by faith. And you know, you say that what was it the great offense that was created by Eve? What was the great offense offense. What was the crime that she committed? Somebody say it. What was it? What was it? What was it? She ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, of understanding, you know, and that's problematic in my view. So we got to be able to at least discuss this stuff. You know, whether you agree with anything or not, but at least you got to have the discussion. Why can't you have what is it, my religion, that prohibits me from having a discussion with somebody, you know? Anyway, so we talk about materialism teaches that the world and its laws are knowable, and that while much in the material world may not be known, there is no unknowable sphere of reality which lies outside the material world, that you can know it, we can find out. We don't necessarily have the answers today, but if we keep searching and investigating, if we do that appropriately, we can find the answers to all these questions that we are confronted with as people. And that there are laws of social development. There are laws that we can understand. I'm going to move fast because we don't have that much time. We say mechanistic materialism is, we say there's dialectical materialism, and then we say that when we talked about idealism, we talked about materialism, and then we said there's another form of materialism that is not dialectical, it is mechanistic materialism, that is opposed to dialectical materialism. Mechanistic materialism understands nature and society to function in the manner of a machine. The actions of its component part being the explanation for the eternal repetition of the same kinds of mechanical processes. Yes, I'm not on a page. It's in the book though, but for your benefit, let's go to a page. Oh, there you are. Let's go to, but let's go back to page 26. Let's read this. We say, I think it's on page 26. It says, here on page 26, the first two paragraphs. Let me read. Again, idealists tell us that what is most important for us all is the inner life of the soul. They tell us that we shall never solve our human problems except by some inner regeneration. This is something that really gets preached at Africans all the time. You know, by the bourgeoisie, by the social system, by all of this stuff, that there's something wrong with us, that we have to, you know, and they go not just so, but they even come up with a cultural thing that's responsible for our poverty and oppression, etc. And of course, there's been a genetic thing. Say, this is a favorite theme in the speeches of well-fed persons, but many workers fall for it too. In factories, for example, well, that's something else. Again, an idealist approach is common amongst many socialists. Many sincere socialists, for example, think that what is essentially wrong with capitalism is that goods are unfairly distributed, and that if only we could get everyone, including the capitalists, to accept a new conception of fairness and justice, then we could do away with the evils of capitalism. Socialism to them is nothing but the realization of an abstract idea of justice. And we know socialists like this. AAPRP was that kind of socialist. And there are others. When I say the AAPRP, not just them, but they take the concept of socialism, in fact, and they think of socialism as a form of welfare, where, you know, people just do right and help the poor, etc., etc. Socialism is that juncture where the workers have controlled the means of production, where the workers themselves are now the leaders of society, where the means of production are in the hands of the working class. That's socialism. You know, it ain't something that students make. It's something that the workers, you know, make, and the workers, you know, now control state power. The workers are in control of the state. That is socialism. I don't care what you call it. I don't care who is talking about it. Like Libya, I like Gaddafi, and I will defend him right now. But what Gaddafi has in Libya is not socialism. Socialism is not how do they characterize it in some kind of brother, what is it? Brother leader. Socialism is not brother leader making the oil resources available so that you can have free education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Socialism is where the workers themselves have control of the state. That is socialism. If you ain't talking about that, you ain't talking about socialism. And, that's different. I mean, I mentioned Gaddafi, but I'm mentioning him just in passing. He, of course, is not the problem. The problem, of course, is those people who are trying to overturn that because they fear the consequences of the victory of African oppressed peoples around the world that will result in real socialism happening in the world. So there are people who believe that they call themselves socialists, etc., and they think that simply just because of how you can just redistribute stuff, But the fact is that everything that you're talking about redistributed, who created it? Workers. It's the workers who created that, and yet the workers have no authority, no control, etc. They're just going to treat them like welfare recipients. They will just make sure that you can go to school and you can get, but nothing about the authority over the society itself. We say that the idealism of this belief lies in its assumption that it is simply the ideas which we hold that determine the way we live and the way society is organized. Those who think in this way forget to look for the material causes. Did you say something? Did I respond to it, DC? Did you raise something? Okay. The idealism of this belief lies in its assumption that it is simply the ideas which we hold that determine the way we live and the way society is organized. Those who think in this way forget to look for the material causes. For what in fact determines the way goods are distributed in capitalist society, the wealth enjoyed by one part of society while the other and the greater part lives in poverty, is not the ideas which men hold about the distribution of wealth, but the material fact that the mode of production rests on the exploitation of the worker by the capitalist. So long as this mode of production remains in existence, so long will extremes in wealth and poverty remain, and so long will socialist ideas of justice be opposed by capitalist ideas of justice. The task of socialists, therefore, is to organize and lead the struggle of the working class against the capitalist class, and to the point where the working class takes power. The working class takes power from the capitalist class. That's socialism. That's socialism. But there's another example that we can use that's kind of in vogue right now in the African community about this thing about that the notion that the ideas that we hold determine the way we live, and that is like the Willie Lynch syndrome thing. And Africans in this room know what I'm talking about, this Willie Lynch thing, that somehow in 16, that some white guy from the Caribbean, a plantation owner, came, I think, someplace in Virginia and made a short speech and told the slave owners that if you do this, you'll be able to control the slaves, for 300 years. You'll be able to control. And what you do is pit the light-skinned ones against the dark-skinned ones, the old against the young, and, just a whole bunch of nonsense like that. And then, you hear people like Farrakhan and other people mention the Willie Lynch thing. That's what's happening. But that is absolute nonsense. It's idealism, at its height. Because it ain't no ideas. No white man made a speech in 1700 and something that's responsible for African people not fighting and taking over our situation. It didn't stop Garvey. What stopped Garvey? Say it again. And the state, the police, right? It didn't stop Malcolm. What stopped Malcolm? And the petty bourgeoisie. It didn't stop King. It was no letter. It wasn't thousands of African people who've been in motion struggling against this system in this country. It's the petty bourgeoisie who wrote that letter. There's the petty bourgeoisie who manufactured this hoax. Because somehow there's an assumption that if we can just fix these things, etc., that, these ideas in our brain, that somehow we would win our freedom. This is the petty bourgeoisie that doesn't have any relationship to the state. Doesn't have any relationship to the state. Because we know, what happened. What year was that, Gaida, when the lights went off in New York? Was it 70-something? Everybody went shopping? And the thing that keeps them from shopping now is the damn lights won't go off anymore, and they probably got it computerized. But the fact is, it's the state. It's the organization of repression. Not some letter, not something some white guy wrote, like in 1700 and something that keeps us, from being able to fight for our freedom. Which is not to say that there are not ploys and schemes and conspiracies and things like that constantly being worked against us. Of course that happens, but that's not the essence of why we don't win our freedom. If we had somebody who would do in this city or this country what the whole white world is doing in Libya, right, where they identify a certain opponent to Gaddafi, arm them to the teeth, right? Arm them to the teeth, give them air power, missiles, and all this other kind of stuff like that. I'm telling you right now, this country will be in big time trouble, regardless of what letter anybody might have written in 1700 and something. I'm in this community right now, armed to the teeth. When I say to the teeth, maybe if just a couple of hundred AKs would do it. They don't have to be as well armed as the Libyans. The notion of some person writing some message, giving some advice to white planters, plantation owners in 1700 and something is a bourgeois nonsense. It's idealism magnified. Let me see on page 27. We say it can be seen from these examples how idealism serves as a weapon of reaction. That's on the second column. And how when socialists embrace idealism, they are being influenced by the ideology of the capitalists. We can no more take over and use capitalist ideas for the purposes of socialist theory than we can take over and use the capitalist state machine with all its institutions and officials for the purpose of building socialism. Right through history, indeed, idealism has been a weapon of reaction. Whatever fine systems of philosophy have been invented, idealism has been used as a means of justifying the rule of an exploiting class and deceiving the exploited. This is not to say that truths have not been expressed in an idealist guise. Of course they have. For idealism has very deep roots in our way of thinking, and so men often clothe their thoughts and aspirations in idealist dress. But the idealist form is always an impediment, a hindrance in the expression of truth, a source of confusion and error. I love Malcolm X, but Malcolm's problem was he was not consistently materialist. He also had one foot, or certainly a toe, in idealism, the camp of idealism, the boogeyman, spookism, the mothership, this kind of stuff, And of course, Malcolm was also incredibly powerful precisely because he was the expressions of political truth, materialist political truth. That's what made Malcolm stand out from King and everybody else, because he wielded this weapon of materialism, so powerfully, more lucid than anybody else of the time, and most people since then. But in fact, I tried to join the Nation of Islam at one time because of Malcolm X, because of the influence of Malcolm X. And then the first meeting I had with them, where they, had to go to the, Eva Yaqub, creating the white man, through et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It threw me. I couldn't handle that, and that's what kicked me out of it. But I love Malcolm, and when I listen to the message of the grassroots, and I, read, much of other things that he said. But Malcolm, if you listen to some of the other stuff on that Ooga Booga-ism, it's not useful at all. I remember, what was it that Malcolm was having hurricanes inflicting damage on the oppressors, etc. And he was explaining this is why it was happening because of how bad they had treated us. So Malcolm, he had one foot in idealism and the other foot, like materialism. Yes, Janice. Yes. Racism is a worldview. I mean, racism actually is it is the ideological underpinning of imperialism. But what happens is that the victims of this ideology assumes that the idea itself is what is oppressing us. That the fact that white people got ideas about us is that is simply the ideological justification. That is the ideological, and it's reproduced over and over in the society that justifies the colonial condition of African people. So then you hear us talking about struggling against our conditions, you will hear a racist response right away come from white people. Because the ideology, the ideological underpinning, because America and imperialism cannot explain itself. It can't explain itself outside of this ideological assumption. It can't explain where it got everything from. That's why you have Santa Claus. Really, and I mean this in a literal sense of the word. It cannot explain. That's why you have, the concept, the legal concept that possession is 99%. If you got it, so you don't even have to explain where you got it from, how you got it. If you got it, that's the starting point, of certain principles. So it is the ideological underpinning. And not only is it something that's been fed and subsequently embraced by white people, but Africans also have embraced, in many instances, the same ideological assumptions. The difference being that Africans are also, the ideology, the idea in the head is constantly being, affected by the material reality that we are confronted with. So even when we have these same bad ideas about ourselves, on the one hand, we find ourselves having to fight against the actual conditions of colonialism, even as white people find themselves trying to reinforce those relationships. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. But racism is the ideology. It is the ideological underpinning. Yes, yes. When you take the ism, when you give it an ism, when it's characterized and it becomes an ism, when it becomes how did Marx put it, that ideology, once it grips the masses like a material force, when it becomes the guiding thing of your understanding of the society, then it's a form of idealism. It removes the key fundamental, social, economic, contradictions. It abstracts everything away from that. Yeah, it is a form of idealism. Iapo. That's exactly, just another way of saying the same thing. There's a form of idealism, and that's what idealism does. That's what idealism does. It muddies up the waters. It keeps you from even being able, for example, if you say the problem is racism, let's just quickly, let's say that the problem is racism. Okay. Somebody tell me the solution offered for racism. What's the solution? Give me something. Say it again. I didn't hear you. Anti-racism class? Yeah. Unlearning racism. Unlearning racism. Unlearning racism. Unlearning racism. What else? Integration. With integration. What else? Huh? No, racism is a problem. You can't kill them. Because that makes you a racist in reverse or something like that. You can't kill them. That's the problem. That's one of the problems of racism. You know, you can't kill the racist. Say it again. Amalgamation, integration, anti-discrimination laws. And of course there is separation is a okay. So that's you know that's pretty good. That's pretty good thing. And then of course one thing about if racism is a problem is you know is learning to be loved. Acceptance, right? To be accepted, right? Isn't that what we victims of racism have to learn how to be accepted? Isn't that part of what we learn? To be accepted. You know, to wear your pants up and learn good diction and you know, to be acceptance. How's that? Yeah. Okay, so that's okay. You see, this is racism, and I could have done. And next time you do this also. You ask for examples of racism, right? How does racism manifest itself in the world? For examples. Now, let's say colonialism. How do we deal with that? Independence. Okay, but let's talk it more like in actions that we can take. Revolution. Anything else? Colonialism is the problem, not racism. Colonialism is the problem. What else? What can we do? Same things, independence, having our own state, etc. But the main point that I want to make here is that when you start talking about, this is not just an abstract discussion that we're having. Racism, you see, doesn't take us anywhere. But at least when you talk about colonialism, you're talking about something really concrete, a real phenomenon that can be described in sociological and economic, and political terms that you can struggle against. And you can fight for independence, and you can make revolution, and there are other kinds of things that you can do. When you talk about community control of schools, that's an expression of a struggle against colonialism as opposed to integration, right? So that's why we're saying this is not just some kind of abstract discussion that we're having. This is a real practical struggle. Now, here's how some of the idealists have got us. Because I remember this brother who my most recent struggle was around Barack Obama, when we did a piece a long time ago saying that the problem was colonialism and not racism. And he either wrote or called me and said, look, we know that colonialism is a question, but we can't abandon this whole question of racism. And just recently, he's talking to me about having to have some kind of anti-racism conference, and to try and get Obama to host an anti-racist discussion, like with people around the country. And that's dead end. It's bankrupt, and also it it disarms people, and it doesn't take us anywhere toward assuming responsibility for our own freedom. Racism keeps you from doing that. So now the other thing that the idealists do is because they run into what we said, so they come up with some kind of compromise thing that they call institutionalized racism, which is another way of saying colonialism. You know why? You know, we didn't hear the Vietnamese saying we're suffering from institutionalized racism. Nobody in the world talk about that except us. We're the ones who have been victimized by racism, and it's a real insidious assumption here. It's really insidious because what it means is that I remember when Samora Machel made this great speech after Mozambique became independent, standing up in a pinstripe suit in the middle of Maputo, I think it was, you know, declaring to the world that we are not racist. What in the hell is somebody in the middle of East Africa standing up talking about we are, to who the hell is he talking to? You know, who are we proving to whom are we proving we are not racist? You know, because, and why is it that every time African people talk about freedom, liberation, that it has always something to do with a rejection somehow of white people, that it's an offense against white people somehow for us to talk about freedom and independence. So we have to be against racism, because that keeps white people in the center, philosophically, ideologically, because what you oppose to is the ideas that's in the heads of white people. And you just want to win acceptance, just want to make them like you. You just want to do something that keeps them in the center. And when you start talking about independence, anti-colonialism, you start defining the problem as colonialism, then they have a problem. And then what about the white people becomes the question that always, well, what about the white people, right? And of course, we've been quite open and frank in our response. Hell, they can get a job like everybody else. You know, take your chances just like everybody else, you know. And the world is constructed and people have to not do anything to win their freedom because they have to be concerned about the white people. No. That's absolutely insane. And I'd have to be crazy, and probably was for a while, to think like that. So, you know, idealism is insidious. It really keeps us from, you know, like moving forward and solving real problems in the world. So, yes, comrade. What page is you on? What page were you on? Okay, go ahead.
You know, I think that we've developed this a little further because we saw like people like got in there with the power in Chile going to use the same capitalist state to kick his ass, you know.
Mm-hmm. They killed him, murdered him, yeah.
It did. So I think this is a big what he's talking about here, and you know, other socialism or Judaism, I think we were in Tanzania. You know, bourgeois ideology, you know, this track before. But in terms of, the current course says himself that this should not be said, we should develop it further. I think we have in terms of socialists, we developed this point that socialists have seized power, but that has not been socialism. So
yeah. Yeah. I mean, you've got, you know, I mean, this is one of the things you find people who declare themselves to be avowed Marxists and end up, you know, making the most ridiculous assumptions about the election of Barack Hussein Obama as president of the United States. And, you know, these amazing declaration about what that's supposed to mean in terms of some kind of progress for the, and not just, you know, the struggle of African people, but for the workers. I mean, this is what they have been able to say. So it is idealism to the max. I want to just say something briefly about there is another kind of materialism, that we characterize as mechanistic materialism. And if you go to page 36, let's see, I just wanted to read. Here are the weakness and limitations of mechanistic materialism. We say that mechanistic materialism is opposed to dialectical materialism. Mechanistic materialism understands nature and society, this is not on 36, but to function in the manner of a machine, the actions of its component parts being the explanation for the eternal repetition of the same kinds of mechanical processes. This is a mechanistic materialist. And then on page 36, we say the weakness and limitations of mechanistic materialism. Mechanistic materialism had great weaknesses. And Cornforth, puts forth that mechanistic materialism is something that, that an emerging bourgeoisie, overthrowing feudalism and in Europe and discovering, creating factories and industrial revolution and things like that, seeing machines as just being so fundamental to all kinds of progress. And so you have these mechanistic materialism. It said mechanistic materialism had grave weaknesses. It could not sustain the materialist standpoint consistently and all the way. For if the world is like a machine, who made it? Who started it up? There was necessary in any system of mechanistic materialism a supreme being outside the material world, even if he no longer continuously interfered in the world and kept things moving, but did no more than start things up and then watch what happened. Right? That's said mechanistic materialism too sees change everywhere, yet because it always tries to reduce all phenomena to the same systems of mechanical interactions, it sees this change as nothing but the eternal repetition of the same kinds of mechanical processes, an eternal cycle of the same thing. Number 3 on page 37, still less can mechanistic materialism explain social development. Mechanistic materialism expresses the radical bourgeois conception of society as consisting of social atoms interacting together. The real economic and social causes of the development of society cannot be discovered from this point of view. And so great social changes seem to spring from quite accidental causes. Human activity itself appears to be either the mechanical result of external causes or else it is treated, and here mechanistic materialism collapsed into idealism as purely spontaneous and uncaused. In a word, mechanistic materialism cannot give an account of men's social activity. So we talk about from dialectical from mechanistic to dialectical materialism. And I'm going to read, and you have it on page 40. So in order to find how the limitations of the mechanist approach can be overcome, we may consider first of all certain extremely dogmatic assumptions which are made by mechanistic materialism. These mechanistic assumptions are none of them justified, and by bringing them to the light of day and pointing out what is wrong with them, we can see how to advance beyond mechanistic materialism. We're talking about mechanistic materialism, the assumption, you've heard it said over and over again, that that history just repeats itself over and over, etc. It does not take assumption to development at all. That will happen in processes, and we say mechanism sees all change as having at its basis permanent and stable things with definite fixed properties. Thus, for the mechanist, the world consists of indivisible, indestructible material particles which, in their interaction, manifest such properties as position, mass, velocity. So according to mechanism, if you could state the position, mass, and velocity of every particle at a given instant of time, then you would have said everything that could be said about the world at that time, and could, by applying the laws of mechanics, predict everything that was going to happen afterwards. This is the first dogmatic assumption of mechanism, but we need to reject it. For the world does not consist of things but of processes. The world does not exist of things but of processes in which things come into being and pass away. The world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, wrote Engels, but as a complex of processes in which things apparently stable no less than their mind images in our heads, the concepts go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away. We talk about here on page 41, matter and motion. The second dogmatic assumption of mechanism is the assumption that no change can ever happen except by the action of some external cause. Just as no part of a machine moves unless another part acts on it and makes it move, so mechanism sees matter as being inert, without motion, or rather without self-motion. For mechanism, nothing ever moves unless something else pushes or pulls it. It never changes unless something else interferes with it. No wonder that regarding matter in this way, the mechanist had to believe in a supreme being to give the initial impulse. But we need to reject this lifeless and dead theory about matter. This theory separates matter from motion. It thinks of matter as just a dead mass, so that motion always has to be impressed on matter from outside. But on the contrary, you cannot separate matter and motion. Motion, said Engels, is the mode of existence of matter. Quote, motion is the mode of existence of matter. Never anywhere has there been matter without motion, nor can there be. Motion in cosmic space, mechanical motion of smaller masses on the various celestial bodies, the motion of molecules as heat or as electrical or magnetic currents, chemical combinations of disintegration, organic life. At each given moment, each individual atom of matter in the world is in one or other of these forms of motion or in several forms of them at once. All rest, all equilibrium is only relative and only has meaning in relation to one or other definite form of motion. A body, for example, may be on the ground in mechanical equilibrium, may be mechanically at rest, but this in no way prevents it from participating in the motion of the earth and in that of the whole solar system, just as little as it prevents its most minute parts from carrying out the oscillations determined by its temperature or its atoms from passing through a chemical process. Matter without motion is just as unthinkable as motion without matter. All things. The floor that I'm standing on, is the thing that is motion and is matter in motion. That's what holds it together. The fact that you have, matter that's in a constant state of motion. When like I said, you can't conceive of such a thing as matter without motion any more than you can think of motion without matter. It said that on page 43, was the world created by a supreme being? What was the origin of matter? What was the origin of motion? What was the very beginning of everything? What was the first cause? These are the sort of questions that puzzle people. Is it possible to answer these questions? No, the world was not created by a supreme being. Any particular organization of matter, any particular process of matter in motion has an origin and a beginning. It originated out of some previous organization of matter, out of some previous process of matter in motion, but matter in motion has no origin, no beginning. Science teaches us the inseparability of matter and motion. However static some things may seem to be, there is in them constant motion. The atom, for instance, maintains itself as the same only by means of a continual movement of its parts. So in studying the causes of change, we should not merely seek for external causes of change, but should above all seek for the source of the change within the process itself, in its own self-movement, in the inner impulses to development contained within these things themselves. Thus, in seeking the cause of social development and its laws, we should not see social change as being brought about by the actions of great men who impress their superior ideas and will on the inert mass of society, nor as being brought about by accidents and external factors, but as being brought about by the development of the internal forces of society itself. That means by the development of the social forces of production. Thus, unlike the utopians, we see socialism as the result not of the dreams of reformers, but of the development of capitalist society itself, which contains within itself causes which must inevitably bring it to an end and the lead to the socialist revolution. And we believe that, but we believe it differently from what Cornforth has said, for the reasons that we've talked about, like in the past. Third, the third dogmatic assumption of mechanism is the assumption that the mechanical motion of particles, i.e. the simple change of places of particle as the result of the action of them on them of external forces, is the ultimate basic form of motion of matter, and that all changes, all happenings whatsoever can be reduced to and explained by such mechanical motion of particles. Thus all the motion of matter is reduced to simple mechanical motion. All the changing qualities which we recognize in matter are nothing but the appearance of the basic mechanical motion of matter. However varied the appearances may be, whatever new and higher forms of development may appear to arise, they are all to be reduced to one and the same thing, the eternal repetition of the mechanical interaction of the separate parts of matter. This is this is something that we challenge. We say instead that, and we quote Engels here on page 44, motion is the most general, in the most general sense, wrote Engels, conceived as the mode of existence, the inherent attribute of matter, comprehends all changes and processes occurring in the universe from mere change of place right to thinking. The investigation of the nature of motion has as a matter of course to start from the lowest, simplest form of this motion and to learn to grasp these before it could achieve anything in the way of explanation of the higher and more complicated forms. Anyway, the last dogmatic assumption of mechanism is to be mentioned is that each of the things or particles whose interactions are said to make up the totality of events in the universe has its own fixed nature and quite independent of everything else. In other words, each thing can be considered as existing in separation from other things as an independent unit. And then on page 47 it says the correction of mechanistic materialism. When we bring into the open and reject these assumptions of mechanistic materialism, then we begin to see the need for a materialist doctrine of a different or a new type, a materialism which overcomes the weaknesses and narrow dogmatic assumptions of mechanism. This is dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism understands the world not as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes in which all things go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away. Dialectical materialism considers that matter is always in motion, that motion is the mode of existence of matter, so that there can no more be matter without motion than motion without matter. Motion does not have to be impressed upon matter by some outside force, but above all it is necessary to look for the inter-impulses of development, the self-motion inherent in all processes. Dialectical materialism understands the motion of matter as comprehensive